So we're joined by, nobody wants to sit beside me, Joe. We're joined by our 3 returning scholars and 2 Nuffield alumni, Joe Burke, who was a 2015 scholar and is Beef and Livestock Sector Manager with Board BIA, and Lance Woods, who was a 2022 scholar, is that right?
22 scholar, yeah.
And Ruminant Marketing Manager with MSD Animal Health Ireland. I'll come to you, Joe, first. 3 great presentations. What are your initial thoughts?
Yeah, you're right, Helen. 3 really interesting and engaging topics, and you could really sense the passion as well that each of them had. That they've all been on a really interesting 2-year journey now, and seen, I suppose, really exemplary producers and case studies. Many of them relevant to their own topics then around the world. And then, to come back and to condense it all down into 12 minutes, obviously, is not easy either.
Some didn't manage to do it.
No, look, we won't name and shame or put the focus on anyone for that, because I think we'll, certainly, feel that it was worthwhile. I like Nick. Really interesting presentation. I might even let Lance here beside me, who maybe represents those marketeers that Nick talked about, the people who are trying to push the wormers on us. Maybe.
I think we need to have a serious chat later on, Nick.
Yeah.
Aside from that, I think compliment all 3 presentations. I think 3 incredibly varied presentations, thought-provoking and really impact delivered. I suppose if I start on Nick's. I think, well, number 1, it's great to see somebody representing the sheep sector in Nuffield, number 1, because I think sometimes the sheep sector, I suppose, gets neglected or forgot about, not only in Nuffield, but I suppose in the wider agricultural industry. So I think a really positive step to have somebody here representing the sheep, and what a better man than Nick. I suppose something that came out for me, Nick, was... and it brings me back to my own Nuffield, because I suppose they could be linked in certain ways. I looked at how animal health can positively impact climate change targets. But something that really came out for me when I delved a little bit deeper was, ultimately, if you go back to your number 1 point, back to the basics, and we see it in the animal health world as well, whereas if there's 2 shots required in a vaccination, there's a massive drop-off in that second shot, and the second shot is actually what gives that immunity. So it's so important to give those 2 shots in a 2-course vaccine. But how do we work with farmers? How do we work with farmers to ultimately work on that? And I looked at behaviour change and mindset, but looking through, have we any golden nuggets around, okay, how do we subtly get a farmer to check his drenching gun, to work more in compliance? And it's the basics, but I think there's a huge basic mindset or behaviour change required there. What can we do there to help farmers?
Yeah, I suppose before I tell you what the silver bullet is, like, you couldn't be more correct, I suppose. Tommy Heffernan was the person who, he's a very well-known vet, I suppose, and he was the person who encouraged me to do a Nuffield. And like, Tommy in his workshops always talks about being brilliant at the basics. And the 2 farmers that I opened my presentation with, Leslie Koppel and Rob Foreman, something I didn't say is that Rob actually gave resistance to Leslie. So Rob was selling replacement animals to Leslie. Leslie's quarantine protocol wasn't a proper protocol to mitigate resistance, and she bought in Rob's, to call a spade, maybe not so good practices, and they instantly got drench resistance, had to refinance the farm. A massive, difficult time from doing something that is relatively straightforward, not expensive, just takes planning and thought. Ultimately the solution is, if you look at New Zealand has got to the stark situation where 40% of their sheep farms, none of the traditionally used drugs work anymore. And like, if we look at the costs on their farms, the difference in growth rates in lambs is 9 kilos after a 5-month grazing season from using ineffective drugs. It's 4.7 kilos on carcass weight. If you put that at current Irish prices, it's 36 euros per lamb. Now, on an Irish farm, it's 6 grand. If you go off 2024 incomes, it's a 24% reduction on income. If we scale that up to New Zealand figures like Leslie, 9,000 breeding ewes, resistance was costing them 450,000 euros a year.
Wow.
So, like, we're sleepwalking into this from not doing the basics. Now, New Zealand have really got on top of this primarily through Beef and Lamb New Zealand, which is their farmer lobby group, so it's funded by farmers. And farmers came to them and said, this is the #1 problem for us because we are not going to be profitable going forward. And what they've done is set up these on-farm workshops, realising that the sheep sector is a bit more unique relative to the dairy sectors, where I suppose veterinary engagement is higher. I mentioned the statistics in Irish sheep in terms of 92% of sheep farmers not planning their parasite control with vets. It's quite well mirrored over in New Zealand. So they realised, let's go for a workshop approach. Let's have one vet be really efficient and work with 20 farmers in a room and get farm-specific worm control. The recommendations are fine, but they're just like the exercise a bit more neat, a bit less. We go off and go do mad cardio. We think we should starve ourselves. They're not. We can't embed them into our lives. And we see it in Ireland. Like, one recommendation is to rotate your drenches. And Animal Health Ireland, in that survey data, they mentioned that on that recommendation, a lot of farmers are just rotating between one brand to another without realising that the whole time they're actually using the same active ingredient. So farm-specific advice, a bit like John on the TB side, farm-specific advice is where we need to be at.
I was just wondering, Nick, in relation to, and even to the background to your topic, like, you come from an organic background, so I know some of the organic sheep farmers that I've spoken to, they're able to get the sheep, the lambs obviously, to 35 kilos, 38 kilos, and then they have a bit of a worm breakdown or a bit of a worm burden then, and then they're faced with, well, they have to double the withdrawal period in comparison to a conventional farm. Does that place challenges, or is that maybe part of the background why this became such an interesting topic to you?
Yes. I suppose it's a contentious input in organic systems. There's no doubt about that. Now, interestingly, the Australian and the American organic standard, which I looked at, proposes some mad stuff, which is a zero anthelmintic drench policy. And like, if we look within the European system then on organics, obviously we haven't gone that way because animal health is one of the statutory mandatory regulations. It's one of the 5 freedoms, is freedom from disease. It's one of the most fundamental things we have to do as farmers. So I think even within organics, look, it's as much as necessary as possible, but the target absolutely cannot be zero, and no one should be pushing for such as that. And that's where, I suppose, Lance, you were referring about having a chat later. I suppose that's not so much, it's as much drug retailers as it is the research that back in the 1950s, we thought we could just use these things once a month. And we never thought of, well, what if they stop working someday? Yeah. And now we've come to a situation of realizing we can't do that anymore. And in fairness, I think a lot of drug manufacturers are getting on board with more sustainable use and pushing, because look, I mean, there's not going to be a market for the drugs to be sold into. If they don't work, no one's going to buy them.
As a layperson listening to it, what struck me was, I suppose, the fact that as there's an over-reliance maybe on data and science, stockmanship becomes less important, or maybe farmers lose confidence in their stockmanship. And even that statistic you had, that study about, I suppose, formally trained farmers versus ones who weren't, and how much better the outcome was. So I suppose for the panel in general, are farmers losing the innate skills or becoming less confident in knowing their own animals?
I think we've had this transition, and it's happened at such a pace. And I suppose that's been part of the issue with then getting compliance with some of the newer recommendations, because farmers, they look on the ground, they're trusting gut instinct, and everything that they're seeing on the ground is telling them they need to reach for the drench bottle. But yet they're being instructed based on one data source to make a decision, when in reality, as I said, it's like looking at the weather. Met Éireann will say one thing, Meteo Blue will say another thing, Carlow Weather might be saying another thing. But you see, generally, if 3 or 4 of them are saying it's going to rain tomorrow, you're not hopping in the tractor doing jobs. But if we just relied on one, we're going to get things wrong more often than not. And I think acknowledging that the farmer's input, and this is where I suppose the workshops come into play, it's not a vet lecturing a hall and telling everybody this is what you're supposed to do, because we know that doesn't work in terms of change management. All the studies will show that. What it is seeing the farmer as an equal expert, because they know everything about their farms. And without the knowledge of the farms, the vet cannot give any advice. So it's bringing the two together, and I think that's something that is under-recognised and under-acknowledged.
Yeah. And I suppose one other thing that I thought was using subsidies almost as a way of tackling the problem. You mentioned payments for farmers, maybe attending workshops and things. I wonder for the two alumni what your opinion on that is.
Yeah, I think when it comes to the sheep sector, I think a challenge that we find in our business in the animal health industry is it's sometimes harder to connect to the sheep farmer. The dairy farmer is so much more involved in discussion groups, KT groups, and as is the beef farmer. I think there's a lot more events. It comes back to maybe the sheep being sometimes a forgotten sector. So I think it is a challenge to properly connect. I don't know whether you'd agree with that or not, Nick, but it sometimes is harder to connect to the sheep farmer. And even if that's only through an education and awareness or a workshop campaign.
Yeah, like if you look at, and Mike, you had stuff up there in terms of the percentage that subsidies make up of incomes. It's about 24% maybe on the dairy side, it's about 44% on the beef, it's 110% on the sheep side. Now, we've had the EU Green Deal and I suppose the transition to environmental measures. What it means is that for many sheep farmers, they've looked, call a spade, they've chose to milk the system as opposed to operating on technical brilliance. Like if you look at, I mean, I know many farmers down our part of the way who are organic, they're making 40 grand a year from direct subsidies, they might sell 6 grand a lamb. Okay, if they were technically brilliant, they might sell 12 grand a lamb, but you're looking at the effort required. And the problem that we have ultimately is the subsidies are paying for income forgone and not incentivizing technical brilliance. And the problem that you have there is it's short term in terms of putting money into the pockets and keeping things going, but it's not building long-term resilience in our sector. Like as a young person coming into the sector, if you're seeing a farm that's stagnant, is not engaged in knowledge transfer, is not upping their standards, why in God's name would you have an interest in going into that? It's not dynamic. And like the proof of that is in 1950, the number of lambs weaned per ewe was 1.3. In 2024, the number of lambs weaned per ewe was 1.36. Meanwhile, Australia, with all the drought and the extensive management, can wean the exact same number of lambs as us. And I think if we're going to have subsidies and we have to accept we're part of the EU system, let's try to use them to motivate technical efficiency and have long-term sustainability in the sector by slowly upping the game on farms.
It's not more money, it's use the money more wisely, I suppose, then.
Yeah, and it's just drench resistance is going to wipe us out because like if you look at New Zealand, Leslie and Rob changed primarily the way they've solved resistance is reduced the amount of days that lambs are at grass. They don't finish lambs on grass anymore. They finish them on crops. Now, if we look at the sheep sector in Ireland, most of it's happening in the west of Ireland, where putting in crops is simply not going to be an option. So, given we're only about 5 years behind New Zealand, you're going to face a situation where, I mentioned that 36 euros per lamb, that's going to become a reality, and we're not going to be able to solve the problem the way New Zealand have. So it's really important. And I mentioned on the beef side, right there as well with the same recommendations, just probably 5 years behind the sheep sector.
On that as well, I'd say like the big thing, the challenge as well, like farms are getting bigger. Like it's not as, like we don't have, farms are getting bigger in size, but we don't have extra labour units on the farm. So it might be, you know, if you've 50 sheep versus 500 sheep, like it's easier to take care of the 50 and ensure they don't get, you know, antibiotic resistance. But if you have 500, you're just going to be like, oh, we'll dose these here now and, you know, get them out the gap, I suppose. Like we don't have the labour units to achieve it as much as we'd like this one.
Labour saving. Yeah. And if we stick with that animal health then and move on to John's presentation, Joe, come to you first.
Yeah, no, I had come across John before in the TB forum previously, and he was always a vocal commentator anyway within that group and was never shy to, you know, make good practical suggestions of where he thought that, you know, hopefully improvements could be made. Really interested in your presentation today as well, John. A couple of really, really interesting points, including around obviously the examples from around the world, not even just, you know, the far side of the world, but taking the examples from the UK as well, that, you know, I suppose a couple of factors, I suppose, within that kind of regionalisation approach, that the UK isn't too different to us, but here, obviously, there has always been a tradition here of a lot of animal movement. Animals kind of tend to change hands between farmers at least twice anyway during their lifetime before they end up being marketed. So I know from your background in Macra as well that the political side of it will obviously have been, you know, top of mind as well, that where you interfere with kind of farmers' freedoms to sell to another farmer in a different region, or to sell, you know, live as opposed to having to keep the animals and finish them, or maybe sell them to a confined finishing unit. That means challenges. But I know in your study you also highlighted that farmers who have had this problem will all say, look, I would have been happy to take the pain in having had to, you know, sell reactor animals or whatever it was to the factory, rather than have this issue continue long term, that it's in everyone's interests to tackle this problem, even though there will be a bit of pain, obviously, for some farmers.
Yeah, it's I suppose it's interesting at the outset that here in Ireland, one of the things that's lost for the programme is the farmer support and buy-in behind the programme. I've spoken to a number of groups of farmers across the country over the course of the past 2 years, and they would all have said the same thing to me, that line of, we're willing to take some amount of pain and suffering if somebody can show us an end line here, and if we can make progress towards an end line here. The reality of it is it's 70 years now since 1957 that we've been kicking this football around. And it was mentioned earlier on about young farmers, around the statistics of young farmers. About 6,000 farmers under the age of 35 now, 4%. In 2016, that figure was 7,000. So if you want to make progress and make it, and Nick touched on it too, about bringing young farmers into it, it must be attractive and it must move the dial forward. The regionalised approach and the animal movements thing, the disease is not simple. TB is not simple, it's complex. And sometimes we're siloed into a specific one area, that this has to be the area of focus that we look on, and this is the problem. And Molly's picture earlier on of the bins highlights it perfectly. In Ireland, we have about nearly 2 million animal movements a year. I think it's 1.8, 1.9, depending on which year you look at. In New Zealand, their NAIT system it's an animal identification system, is in its relative infancy, but is tracking animal movements. Over the course of a year in New Zealand, that figure can be double. In some years it can be 2 million, in some years it can be 4. It's very drought dependent, it's seasonal dependent. So the idea that we need to restrict solely movement of cattle to solve the disease is incorrect. The disease that we might have to implement some measures in some areas is something that we will have to look at. And the regionalised approach is, if you take the example, and it's all across the country, there's different areas where this example applies, but just take Donegal, for example. It has a low herd incidence of the disease on a county level. In a specific area like the Finn Valley, the herd incidence at times is 10%, 12%, 8%. Sometimes it can be double the herd incidence over the past number of years, while the rest of the county is at 4%, 3%. So could you stand there and look at an implementation plan and say, well, the same measures are going to be effective across that entire jurisdiction and we're going to achieve the same results? I'm not sure if you were running a business and that was the case, that you'd stand there and say, well, that will actually yield us some results. And the regional piece is about targeted measures that are going to affect that targeted area. It takes more resources, yes it does. It takes more investment, and it takes better management. But it's a combination of the full suite of measures in specific areas and consistently implemented. You meet farmers in Ireland and they tell you about the programme here, and many of them in the room here, probably give you 10, or if you met 15 different farmers, they might give you 10 different variations of their experience of the eradication programme. I spent time in New Zealand 3 weeks in the spring there, and a couple of weeks on my GFP, and I spoke to farmers about the eradication programme of TB and also about Mycoplasma bovis. And I honestly could have met one farmer, and that would have been enough, because every single farmer that I spoke to repeated back the same process. Their experience was the same. They went through the same hoops to jump through, they went through the same process in reactors, they went through the same process in monitoring, they exited at the same time. It was consistent. So they could rely on the programme to achieve targets. The stepped approach to targets that I mentioned over there from 1994 to today has shown that.
Okay. Lance, what's your...
Yeah, so I agree with John. Obviously, TB is incredibly complex, and we've been trying to control it for the last 70 years. I think from an animal health perspective, I suppose a global view is vaccine technology is evolving. So as John rightly pointed out in his presentation, there's some light at the end of the tunnel there. And when I say vaccine, I suppose technology is evolving. I suppose at MSD we follow the science, and if you look at a product that we launched last year, Bovis Cryptium, for the first and only vaccine for crypto on farm, that has an innovative vaccine design that we haven't seen before. So there certainly is an opportunity for a marker type vaccine moving forward. So I suppose that's a space to follow closely, but it is incredibly complex, as you well know. I suppose other comments, as a matter of interest, and maybe some of the audience think about it, how did we reach such an historic low in 2016?
So can I touch on the vaccine piece as well?
Yeah.
All right. I know, just on the vaccine piece, the studies are ongoing, obviously, in the UK, and they're on phase 3 at the moment, but historical studies have also taken place. There was a study conducted in Mexico in the early 2000s where it looked at non-infected it had a sample size of non-infected animals, calves. They were divided in two, those that were vaccinated and those that were unvaccinated. They were put with a herd of cows that had a 40% prevalence of the disease, so 40% of them were infected. At the time of slaughter, those calves were left with them for 6 months. 59%, the efficacy of the vaccine was 59%. So 59% of the animals that were vaccinated were safe from the disease despite exposure. So to say we have a silver bullet coming, it isn't accurate. It is a part of a tool that will bring us along the way. Similar studies in New Zealand, 1,286 animals put into a study a number of years ago. They were exposed to the disease. Half of them were exposed, half of them were vaccinated. The efficacy came back a similar 62%, but it was higher when the animals were slaughtered earlier at 74%. So there's also variations in the longevity that the vaccination can last within an animal's immune system, and how many times do we need to revaccinate. And then you also have other studies that show where an animal who was vaccinated 8 hours after birth and at 6 weeks versus an animal that was vaccinated only at 8 hours, that the animal that was vaccinated twice actually had a higher prevalence of TB when exposed to the disease. So it's our old friend TB gives us all these challenges repeatedly. So that's why I mentioned about an implementation program here in Ireland. It won't be just we have it one day, well, let's start doing it. Do we need to do it on every single farm across the whole country in the same week, given the amount of movements that we have? What does the vaccine rollout look like? In terms of 2016, it was a gradual decrease in disease over about 20 to 25 years, and we had an implementation of consistent measures. We also had an approach towards a more, I suppose, enforced approach, if you want to call it, towards wildlife management. So we had significant testing, capturing of our badgers, and obviously culling of those ones which were positive for the disease. And over time, the testing, persistent testing of skin tests led to a accumulation of effect. Also then, after 2016, you have abolition of quotas, larger herds, and once an infection becomes into a herd, obviously the within herd spread becomes has a higher impact on the number of reactors.
Okay. Right, move on to Michael's presentation. Welcome to you first, Joe.
I might have one very last question for John, if that's okay.
Yeah.
And look, there's no silver bullet at all. It's all of those different factors. It's extremely complex. But do you think in New Zealand they had the advantage of having, that different vector, a possum, I think it was, and maybe it was, there's less emotional attachment to possums, maybe, in
They're not as cute as badgers, is that
True. Yeah, look, in terms of public engagement or maybe public barriers as well. So did that give them maybe a little bit easier route, John, to their strategy maybe than maybe for ourselves?
Yeah, the thing to remember here is that the program is about eradicating the disease. So if we find a positive animal with the disease, no matter what the vector is, the program is to eliminate that vector. So we still have that in our arsenal of guns at the moment. How long we're going to be given that social license to do that remains to be seen. And in New Zealand, their approach was, in terms of possums, it was defined as an invasive species. They got a helicopter, put pellets in a fertilizer spreader underneath it, and spread it over a couple of 100 hectares every day. And they reduced the density of the possum population if they were able to reduce it to less than 21 per square kilometre, they no longer remained a vector for the disease. We can't do that, and I don't think anybody would promote that for our badgers. Our badgers that are free from TB, clean badgers, need to be protected like Alcatraz. They need to be seen as friends in the eradication of the program. It's the disease that we're eradicating, not the vectors. So in terms of positive badgers, more trapping, more testing, more vaccination. Review of vaccination efficacy needs to be done as well, but it's the disease we need to track.
Okay. While I have you there then, Michael's presentation.
Yeah, a really, really interesting presentation. Michael, your passion for the subject, came across so strongly from the beginning, even in your introduction, that you're a full-time beef and tillage farmer and a part-time teacher. I'm sure many people in a similar, position would just shows your dedication to your passion, which is really interesting. Like we're at a crossroads. We're at a certainly a challenging situation, faced with 99,000 tons of beef, potentially coming in now from those Mercosur countries. I suppose it's at an advanced stage. You know, none of us here today, unfortunately, have that ability to kind of veto that agreement, and it does seem to be maybe losing the political kind of appetite to block it at this stage. I know that there are various different mechanisms whereby the EU is proposing that they'd be able to put up safeguards, but again, it's important that we would question, you know, how quickly would they kick in, and would they be effective? But certainly the things that we have that within our control in terms of hopefully influencing, you know, how are we marketing our beef? Are we making best advantage of, you know, our strengths, our USPs in terms of our traceability, our sustainable production systems, our grass-based production system as well, and yeah, again, using that as well in order to promote family farming and succession as well, and engagement with Irish agriculture in terms of communities and schools and you know, geez, I found it really, really interesting how that.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. You'll bring some of those tips now back to the office with you, Joe.
Oh, we could do with bringing in Michael, I think, to give lads a bit of a G up and to make sure that you know, they're hearing it from the cold face. Yeah.
Lance?
Yeah, I think, no, really interesting presentation, and it really gets you thinking about it. But I think we do nearly need some alignment on the world's sustainability, and I think this comes up on numerous occasions, but you nearly need alignment of what does sustainability mean to different people, because it can be such a huge variation. I think sometimes we get stuck too much in the environmental piece. And obviously, like in our own company, we talk a lot about, you know, the societal, the environmental, and the economy. But and the work-life balance thing already come up today. But that has to be part of the sustainability as well. And just a really quick example of how sustainability can vary it is, I have a conversation with my wife on a Sunday evening, and I said, look, I'm going to leave about 5:30 in the morning. She's like, that's unsustainable. And I'm like, in my own head, it's perfectly sustainable. I don't have to get porridge into 3 kids. I don't have to get 3 kids stressed on it. So it's an example.
She meant
of the very
unsustainable for her, I
yeah.
think.
Oh yeah. No. Yeah. I know she's very supportive. She's supported me through my Nuffield. But I think it's just
think long term, will you?
it's an example of the difference of, okay, me leaving, because I reckon if you put a heart monitor on me, my heart rate goes up between 7 and 8, and then the middle guy wants porridge and boiled eggs. But it's a very quick example of, like, if you brought 10 farmers into the room and give them, okay, what's sustainability, you're going to get 10 very different answers. So I think almost, and it's relevant to all the presentations, is we nearly need to decide as you know, that alignment around, okay, what is actually sustainability for each sector.
One thing that struck me as well, and I know it's something you're passionate about because you teach as well, was that the getting into the classrooms with children. And there's been an awful lot of discussion about the free hot school meals and discussions about, you know, the quality, where the food comes from. But you did this, the 20k radius of the school, beef that I'm not sure you cooked it, or your mother possibly cooked it for the students, yogurt, cheeses and things like that. And you often think, I know price is an issue, but the hot school meal really could kill 2 birds with 1 stone. You could bring food education, awareness of farming to the classroom as much as feeding children hot meals.
Yeah, like I seen when I done the pilot programme in the national school, like the school meals, to get €3.20 per student for the meal for the day. Like you wouldn't buy a bag of chips for €3.20. So like they got a hot meal and that, and a drink and a bit of banana or something like that. But like even on the school meals, like there was only 2 beef dishes out of 17. Now I know beef is an all-time high for price, so you couldn't blame the company that's providing the meal. But still, like I know it sounds good for the government to say we've free hot school meals, and it does sell well and looks good on a clipboard somewhere, but like the reality of it in the classroom is like they throw out an awful lot of the school meals. They don't eat them. Like a lot of them just bring them home, throw them out. A lot of them don't even order the school meals. I spoke to a good few principals about it, and they all do the same thing. Like a lot of them are wasted. Quality mightn't be, you know, really hectic. For €3.20, like, you know, what could you wouldn't get anywhere for it. But like I visited, say, Sweden and Denmark, and in the Scandinavian countries, they have like kitchens in the schools, and you know, some, even I've seen in Sweden, on the article, there was an article written, and they give food into the schools. So supermarkets provide the food at a reduced cost, and it's then cooked in there, and it provides local employment, but also provides like good quality meals, like, because at €3.20 you wouldn't feed a whole lot, and it doesn't like help the Irish farmer or the Irish food producer. And even like when I went into school, put up different Irish food brands. Like Clone would be the yogurt producer close to us at home, and I got Clone yogurt for him or whatever. But like if you ask the student, like, if you're going to the supermarket, which yogurt now would you pick? And they'd say, oh, sure, the Muller Corner there. And like, you're kind of like, no, that's not the one you pick. You pick the Irish one. You know, know what the Irish brands are, because the seen there, the SuperValue study, 91% of students influence what the parents buy in the supermarket. And as one principal said to me, she said, like a parent doesn't get a childminder. John can maybe answer this, but a parent doesn't get a childminder when they're going to the supermarket. They just bring them on. They bring them with them, and they grab to the trolley or jump in the trolley or on the trolley, John, and they wheel them around the place. But like, they influence what goes into the trolley then.
Yeah.
So if they're aware of the brand or the product, you know, oh, that's good, that's the Irish one, that's an Irish brand, we get this. That makes a huge impact, like, on it.
You want to go in
Just two quick points. If you're shopping with a 2-year-old, it's usually full of sweets.
Yeah.
But just on the school meals, and like, it's important as well that, I know the ICMSA were on, I think it was earlier this year or the end of last year, that some of the produce that's in our school meals is not actually sourced in Ireland.
Yeah.
When we have products here that are competing with, and I know we're an export nation, and we're very much reliant on it. But Joe mentioned about integrating the piece of work that you did about, you know, the educational piece, as well as, it's very hard to educate children on the importance of, well, this food here is Irish and buying Irish, and it comes from Michael 4 miles away, or it comes from Nick 10 miles away, when the piece that's actually in front of them, the glass of milk or whatever it might be, is from the Netherlands or wherever it might be. So, you know, there's a piece of work to be done there too.
No, absolutely. And I suppose with your Board BIA hat on, I mean, it would be the ideal opportunity to educate children a little bit more about food provenance, wouldn't it?
Yeah, definitely. That, you know, there is a job of work to be done, all right, that a lot of the, you know, programs, including, for example, the food dudes, because they're funded by the EU, that there are restrictions in terms of, okay, you know, we have to use European products as opposed to, you know, local and Irish, albeit that, you know, there's so much more value. It doesn't necessarily have to be an EU-funded campaign. It could be something more local, more collaborative. And while food inflation is obviously very real, and, you know, thankfully on the beef side, for example, there has been significant price increase to consumers or rather to producers in the last year. But, like, you know, we still recognise that on average across the EU, consumers only actually spend about 12% of their disposable income on food. So, you know, that was in 2024. It probably has increased in 2025. But, you know, maybe the reason that consumers are a bit more sensitive about it is that many of their other, you know, spending patterns have also increased as well, including around housing, around, you know, other things, and nobody wants to see prices going up at a kind of a local, kind of a personal level. So there is a bit of resistance, but, you know, in terms of that message around local, around quality, certainly that resonates, and at times people have to be reminded to look out for that.
But the problem is, and it's something you touched on as well, I suppose, if we talk about the chief beef coming from Brazil, is that local food, healthy food, goes lower down the list when food is just so expensive. So even, Michael, that idea you had of scanning the QR code of, you know, a steak on a supermarket shelf in France and tracing it back to a farm in Wexford, it's a really lovely idea. But is it something consumers, you think, would be willing to pay a little bit more for?
I suppose, yeah, that's a good point. But it's trying to differentiate yourself from the Mercosur beef. It doesn't mean you can get guaranteed premium price for the premium product. So you're going for the, you know, it's quality and traceability, but, like, it doesn't necessarily mean you get a premium price. It just means that, yeah, it'll be a bit more expensive than Mercosur beef, but, you know, in terms of price, yeah, you can't really demand that, because you just won't get ahead, because, you know, the consumer goes to the, like, everyone says consumers want sustainable beef and sustainable food, but yet then they say, oh, I don't want to eat Irish beef, but then, you know, they have Saturday night and they go down to the chipper and they're getting a big doner kebab, and that came from, you know, God knows where.
They're not asking the man where that beef comes from.
Yeah, they don't care all of a sudden, like, so you kind of, people have double standards, like, when it comes to food and that kind of thing.
It's true. Okay, I'm sure there are plenty of questions in the audience, and we have a microphone here floating around the place. So we have a few hands up. I'm not sure who was the microphone. Oh, there.
Thank you. Campbell Tweed, scholar from Northern Ireland. First, I'd like to compliment all the speakers, and the quality of the presentation is excellent. something that John couldn't have known. In 1957, a Nuffield scholar from Darkley in South Armagh did a report on TB eradication, Charlie Kavanagh, and after he came back, the then Minister of Agriculture in the North, Harry West, called him in for a conversation about TB. So the 70-year cycle still pertains. The big question, and two things really in the TB thing from New Zealand. One, the importance of their infrastructure and farmer-to-farmer conversations and getting into people's heads. The second thing, no animal within 2 years of an active incidence of TB in a herd would be sold for anything other than slaughter. So a lot of breeding stock, or potential breeding stock, goes to the abattoir. The real question now is how we get farmers to properly understand the risks within their own enterprises to handle forward across whatever sector we're in.
Okay.
So firstly, I hope my phone rings at lunchtime from Minister Hayden to look me to go in and speak with him. But in terms of the New Zealand approach, in terms of the breeding females, the stricter animal movements were introduced as the herd incidence decreased. So I think that particular measure was introduced after 2011. I think herd incidence at the time was at 0.4%. So it's obviously very difficult on the herds that affects, but in terms of the progress that the programme had made over time, it wasn't, like today in Ireland that would be 6,000 farms. You know, I mean, it's the stage process of the implementation of measures that is important. And as you get to the thin end of the wedge, the eradication programme in Australia and the eradication programme in New Zealand show that the measures definitely become more stringent, more strict. The experience is a lot tougher for the farmers who are left at the very end. And to emphasise that point, in Australia, when they got to the end of their point, there was a number of herds where they couldn't get the disease out of by the traditional methods, so they tested and they found it to be positive. It was over 40,000 animals in the herd, and they slaughtered them all. Now, I'm not promoting that that's where we get to in Ireland, but it's the staged process of what we need to get to. And in terms of the goodwill of the farmers, or the farmer buy-in and farmer support, some of the farmers I met, for example, down in Southland, I met Simon Grory, and his farm, in the region that they farmed in, had almost no TB for 6 or 7 years. And all of a sudden, his farm was hit with one reactor. And because of the nature of his farm, his runoff, where he wintered his cattle, was 2 or 3 miles away. And the department at the time were telling him that, no, you need to bring back the feed. It's just not feasible, he was telling them. So he had to go to each of the farms he was passing on his route and tell them, well, I'm going to be bringing our herd of cows that's within a breakdown past your herd. And he was terrified to do it. And the day that came to move the animals, and the majority of his neighbours were out to help them to move them, because they saw that this has been a collaborative effort, a collaborative programme, and the only way that they were going to resolve it was by working with one another. That buy-in comes from results. So imposition of measures without yielding results or without targets isn't going to create farmer buy-in. We have a new 30-point plan that was released by the Minister on the 8th or 10th of September, without becoming a lobbyist again here, but the 30-point plan has no target. The 2021 strategy document has no target. So how can you keep accountability? How can you keep progress measured against something if you don't have targets in place to meet them? I mean, I wouldn't run a business at home of a dairy farm if next year I hadn't set my targets of what I want to achieve.
Okay, right, that's great.
I can pick up on Campbell's question, I suppose, in terms of the peer-to-peer communication. I suppose it's one of the recommendations within the workshops, but something that we're doing slightly different in that EIP project. I suppose New Zealand has been very much building the plan in the room, and that's it. Everybody leaves the room. Maybe the farmers talk to each other, but it's funny how Nuffield you end up with random visits, but an Aussie guy was touring Ireland. Andrew Thompson is his name, from Murdoch University. And Andrew we got talking, and I was wondering, well, what's his background? And what he has done is the most successful knowledge transfer program in the history of Australian sheep in particular. So he came up with this lifetime ewe management program. 40% of the Australian sheep flock voluntarily did this. That costed them €1,000 a year to participate in. And the really unique piece was there's a bit of peer pressure created, because they had these groups of 5 to 8 farmers, and you'd go in, you'd get the knowledge, and you'd come up with your plan, and then you had to go in and implement it. And next year, and every year for the next 3 years, we were going to visit 2 of you for about 4 hours. So it's no different to standing up on that stage over there. You're not going to stand up there with no slides, no script, fair play to John though, for memorising it all, and not deliver something. And it creates a soft peer pressure from, not from random farmers, but from farmers in your own community to make those changes. And then I suppose, look, it's no different to losing weight, like, do you know what I mean? And that's being frank about things. Like, I mean, I was sharing a room with a 53-year-old man, Ash man snores. But Ash Wees, he's 53, he's the same age of my dad, and it was a bit embarrassing to have less energy than him, because call a spade, I wasn't fit, like. So, I mean, look, I suppose creating the farming champions was another one of the recommendations that ties into that. And in these discussion groups, if we have farmers who are a bit ahead of the curve, they can demonstrate to other farmers that this can be done. Like, I'm from a fairly traditional sheep farm. I suppose we were busy at other stuff. Like, we were foot-bathing ewes every 3 weeks. We have an indoor lambing system. 60% of the lambs have to get dagged. And then I went to Tom Bull, and I see his aim is to create the genetics to run 8,000 to 10,000 breeding ewes with 1 labour unit. And you're going, how in God's name is this possible? And when you see that it can be done, you believe it, and you figure out how it can be done. And you touched on labour. I mean, one of the pieces that stunned me was that drench resistance, above all else, is a great motivator for an overall improvement in general farming practice. The 2 farmers I mentioned at the start of the presentation, both of their profitabilities are higher than they ever have been before, even when you account for the rise in lamb prices over time. And that's because it's all about having ewes that are in really good body condition, so that they can fight worms with a good immune system. They're going to have more milk, so lambs are going to get off farm quicker. If lambs are off farm quicker, I mean, lambs are the ones creating the worms, because they have no immunity. They take them in, they multiply them, they poo them back out. So every extra day a lamb is on farm, it's contributing to more disease. So if we get the lambs off faster because the ewes have more milk, then we have more grass available at the end of the year for the ewes to be fed better again next year. And this cycle keeps going. So I suppose the thing is for farmers to know that these things are not costing money, or they're not going to add to an additional labour load. They're actually going to increase how much money they make. And, you know, for every hour, especially in part-time sheep farming, which is what we're dominated by in the country, for every hour that you spend on that farm, it's productive, and it turns over as much euro back into your bank.
The added bonuses. I think we have a question at the back here.
Ray Doyle, Lycos. Firstly, I want to commend all the presenters this morning. That was the most professional display I've seen, and I've attended many Nuffield conferences, and I think every one of you deserve great credit for the details that you have and the way you presented all your projects. My question, I suppose, is for John Keane in particular. The first one that sprung to mind was what research he was finding in that pub in Nebraska where he found the Limerick Reg. But apart from that one, on a serious note, John, you mentioned the new 30-point TB plan. Is there anything in that, apart from obvious layering omission of the targets, that you would add to that, or that you see included in it that will be of benefit to us? Because, again, going back to some of your graphs, the low point for TB was about 2013 in Ireland, and it coincided with, I suppose, we're a couple of years only out of quotas, and that explosion has tended to concentrate the disease in dairy herds, and it's what we're seeing now. So again, your findings in the dairy areas, is there anything in particular that we need to focus on that? Because we don't have the tools of getting rid of the wildlife piece. In Scotland, they addressed their TB because they tended to vaccinate the badgers with lead rather than anything else. We don't have those tools to our armoury. And as well as that, and my final observation, is the use of the vaccine. I know you've touched on it, it could be a tool, but is it? Our live exports are over if we use it. Our exports of many dairy products to many dairy countries is technically today over if we actually used the vaccine, albeit whatever guise it is, even if it becomes a marker vaccine, it still won't be accepted. So is it actually accreditably a tool that we could use?
There's a lot to answer there, John.
Good few bits in it. Myself and Nick were sampling the local grain produce that night, so I can feedback it was very good. in terms of the 30-point plan, there are a number of measures in there that are soundly based on science, around the testing, increased testing, the use of gamma interferon testing. There are a number of measures there that will discover the disease sooner and will help us along the road. And I hate to come back to it, but it ultimately is the consistent application of all of the measures that are going to make progress for us. And to touch on the dairy piece, the herds in New Zealand in the early 2000s and into 2010s, the average herd size was 200, 250, 300, 350. It was growing all the time. Significant herds, so once the infection got in, the opportunity for spread was very high. Jane Sinclair, who was one of the head vets that led the eradication efforts in New Zealand, made the statement to farmers and made it to me again when I met her over there. It was, if we can keep the disease out by the introduction through vectors, we'll keep your herd safe. So that was a commitment from them that they'd keep infection out once they looked after the vectors. In terms of how we can put in the 30-point plan, it's a bit like choosing a measure to put a bandage over it at this point in time. A full eradication strategy was implemented in 2021, which is 4 years ago. It gave 9 years to get to the ultimate eradication, as you well know. We're now in 2025 and disease has steadily progressed. We're now putting this band-aid on it to say, well, we're now targeting where the infection is most prevalent, which it is in the dairy herds. But how are we ensuring that imposing these onto dairy farmers and into all farmers will actually lead to a result without having something to target towards? So a whole review of the entire measures that happen inside the farm gate and in the geographical area around it need to be done. In terms of the wildlife, we still have the availability of the capturing and testing of the wildlife. We may not have the wildlife officers to implement that program fully and effectively. I know there are many vacancies in that. That's a major area that we need to be working on. But we still have the opportunity to eradicate the disease in the vectors in the country that carry it. So we still have that arsenal of measure. In terms of vaccines, I know there's a significant amount of work needs to be done around legislation at an EU level, even at a UK level, around whether the animals can be traded on international markets. That legislative piece is a political element of it, and whether there's the political appetite to do that within the EU and within Ireland, that it remains to be seen from a DAFN point of view and from a ministerial point of view. In terms of the practical application of the vaccine, the studies show that there is a certain amount of efficacy of it in terms of protecting the animals. And also other studies show that once an infection becomes prevalent within a herd, the actual transmission from a vaccinated animal who has become infected is about 90% less than an unvaccinated animal to the cohort that it's operated within. So scientifically, it's sound. It's just whether European markets, trade markets, will allow us to vaccinate, as you say, even with a marker vaccine, to trade.
Okay, we've kind of run out of time. We've time for one more. I see a hand over. Oh, we have two. Sorry about that.
Thank you. My name is Seamus McMenamin and I'm a 2025 scholar. 5 excellent presentations, and you've really set the bar kind of scarily high for us for next year, to be honest. My question is actually for Michael. You're sort of in a unique position as a teacher and a farmer. So I suppose my role, I work with Board B, promoting meat. So it was a surprise when my children come home from school with the mantra, don't eat meat on Monday. So it was a bit of a scary position. So do we have a responsibility to educate our educators? Like, they spend 30 hours a week with our children. They have a huge influence on their choices and when they're shopping. And I just wonder, how receptive would the education sector be to more of an input from agriculture in the curriculum?
Yeah, great question. I'd agree, Seamus. I suppose, like, our youngest teachers go through, they're teaching colleges, and like you said, they're educated on history and English and all the rest of it, but yeah, there's very little food education within that. It's definitely something that could be incorporated into, as you said, there's such an influence. They spend such a long period of time through 8 years of primary school with the children, so yeah, absolutely. I suppose the other thing, like we said, meat-free Mondays and stuff, definitely I think when I travel around the US anyway, like they don't even give that any airtime. But the fad around them, vegan diets has definitely fallen off in the last couple of years and somewhat disappeared. I suppose, and Niall said it as well, like in secondary schools, like ag science, like I teach, I taught in a private school, and I taught ag science in the private school, and you'd have here, who you guess go to a private school, none of them from a farm, all of them just done ag science because they wanted to get into medicine or they wanted to get into physiotherapy or whatever they wanted to get into, but they use ag science for points. And I kind of said to him, I remember, got a close relation with them over the 2 years, and said to him, guys, this is a subject you've studied. You go back to your house at home, wherever you go, and you tell the story about Irish farming. They wouldn't have a clue about anything you talk about, but they got such an experience. And some of them, I remember, came up at the end and said, Jesus, I've learned so much more in this subject about food and nutrition and all the rest and what happens on farm, and I have such an appreciation for it now. And these are people who have never set foot on the farm before, and I done a farm walk with them, and they came out to my farm, and they got, they're just blown away by what they see. But that was such a typical good case study of, students that from cities and not from farm backgrounds whatsoever. And I remember a parent came in, and she was a doctor, and she said to me, she said, now I think farmers now have to go to farm school and college. I said, yeah, they're going to that for a good few years. She couldn't get over, now to get a farm, you need to do, a green cert or whatever. But yeah, definitely, I couldn't agree with you more, Seamus. It has a huge impact on them.
Get to the teachers. We have time for one more quick question before we move on to the next.
Joe Deverill from Geeshman, County Offaly. I'm the guy with the 460 out in the front, and it's a pleasure and an honour to have it here, and that's why I'm here.
You might be the only one getting home through the floods, actually.
Just on the TB is a huge problem, as we all know, in the country. And over the years of all the discussions about TB, I have never heard about the method of testing being questioned. I'm 56 years. I was born in 1956, so I'm 1 year older than the TB program, funny enough. But I also remember the windy handle telephones. Who remembers the windy handle telephones? If you wanted to communicate with someone, you had to pick up the receiver, turn the handle, wait for someone down in the local post office, him or her, to answer the phone, then put you through to Mickey Joe, number Tullamore 999 or whatever. And that was the way we used to communicate. Now the technology that we have nowadays in 2025 is amazing. We can take a picture here today, send it to the other side of the world instantaneously. That's the technology we have.
So
but we're still using the windy handle technology to test TB count. Now, I am told, maybe this is beer talk that I heard, it was kind of second-hand talk, that in a certain DVO area in Ireland, they're snaring badgers, they're able to test the badger and have the result for TB result back in 10 to 15 minutes. Wow. And if the badger has TB, they shoot it. Now, maybe that's beer talk. I don't know. I can't stand over that.
John on that.
But there has to be a better way.
Firstly, is it beer talk? And secondly, is there a better way of testing? I know you touched on skin test versus the blood test as well. It was something you touched on your research.
Yeah, Joe, my beer talk is never as intelligent as that anyway, that's for sure. The test I think you're referring to in terms of the badger is a version of the COVID test that we all used to do, a PCR test. And it has a role in terms of wildlife testing and in terms of the accuracy and the approval of it for use in bovines. It isn't quite there for a decision of, well, this animal is a reactor or not a reactor. In terms of the method of how we test animals at the moment, the skin test. So the method of it is still the skin test. The strains and the variants that we're using that's actually put into the animal has evolved and developed over time. The biggest variation in testing, in skin testing, in the sensitivity, which is the determinant of whether an animal is truly positive or not, is the range is between 50 and 85%. That's the sensitivity of it, and there's various factors that affect that. In vaccine is admitted, or how the test is administered, is one of those. The immune system challenge that the animal may have at the time is another one of those. And the prevalence of other circulating diseases and TB within the herd is also an issue. If you can move the dial of the sensitivity to the higher end of 80%, you're obviously going to have a higher number of truly positive animals that you're finding. The blood testing, which I mentioned on the slide, the gamma interferon testing, has a higher sensitivity of over 90%, so it will find more truly positive animals. However, the specificity, which is the ability of the test to define truly negative animals, so she definitely doesn't have TB. Of the skin test, that figure is 99.8%. So if you don't get a reaction of a skin test, she's 99.8% that animal is truly negative. For a blood test, that drops to 96.5%. So there's a 3 to 4% that you may have truly negative animals being identified as positives. So its implementation will find a greater number of true positives, but it would also identify a greater number of true negatives. So it's a balance and it's a mix. That's why I talk about the specificity of the application of different measures, and I would include testing in that. Depending on the area that you're in, depending on the disease outbreak history within the herd, it's specific that we need to apply given to the areas that you're in.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. I'm afraid we've run out of time. If you have any more questions while our panel are having their soup and sandwiches, you can land on top of them and ask them some questions. I'd like to thank our panel, our returning scholars, Nick Cotter, John Keane and Michael Martin, and our Nuffield alumni, Joe Burke and Lance Woods. Thank you all very much.